So up next is Jeremy Durham.
Okay, so I banged this thing together like 2 minutes ago, now like 10 minutes ago, so I don't expect so I used to work at Eons, and I actually work with Luke now at the MathWorks. So I worked at Eons for about a year, from kind of like inception and the whole like idea process of what are we going to use and what technologies are we going to use, blah, blah, blah. All the way to deployment, kind of actually just left there on Friday. So while everything and the way that it works is kind of fresh in my head, I figured I'd give a little presentation on kind of how it's built, and then hopefully answer any questions about it. I think some people are interested probably because of the volume of traffic that they do, and I'll talk more about that, I guess, at the end. And then the number of apps that they have kind of deployed and the deployment process and the deployment schedule that they have for the applications. So basically, their setup is they have 2 software load balancers, 2 machines that run LBS, so it's all free. The idea was to be as cheap as possible. It was a startup, so let's save as much money as we possibly can. They have 8 web servers, which all run Apache. They're all dual core, dual processor, 4 gigs of RAM. And all those boxes run Rails apps. And then I'll get into how many there are and all that stuff. They only have 1 database. They have 1 spare that they use for doing queries on data that may be kind of long-term data or data that would take a long time to process. So they have a box kind of sitting off to the side where you can query that box without affecting the performance of the site in general. There's 1 memcache. That's true. Yeah, so there's 1 memcache box just for caching things. They also use it for session storage. And then they also have a storage array, which is something like 3.5 or 4 terabytes or something. So that array. If there's any questions about that, I'll get into what the actual.
I have a quick question of what eons.com is.
Yeah. So Eons is, because Web 2.0 is great. They are a social networking site for people
Just go to it right now.
Sure.
30 seconds. Thank you.
I don't really want you to see it, but wow. So this is mostly it. So they're a social networking site for people who are 50 plus, and they have a lot of different products, search engines, and all sorts of other related things.
All the products across the top.
Yeah, so some of the products are here, like this cranky thing is a search engine up there, kind of same thing. So all total, they probably have like 14 Rails apps, maybe 15 now or something like that. They're all in production, running the site along with Java apps, and there was potentially some PHP, web objects.
How many Rails apps did you say?
Maybe 14 or 15, so somewhere around there. I don't know, lost track, I think. Yeah, anything else on that?
I think they were interviewed on NECM, and I think you mentioned something about more catering to the baby boomer.
Yeah, exactly.
Crowd,
So
yeah.
the idea for them is that they allow people who are 49 and older to register. And aside from that, you can't register, you can't use a lot of the functionality of the site unless you're 49 or older. So the tools that we used were Apache 2.2. We initially used Apache 2.0, and then we used a proxy balancer, but not proxy will work if you have Apache 2 for whatever reason. They used Mongrel, Subversion, kind of normal stuff for Subversion. We used a lot of Subversion externals. So a lot of shared code, probably, if I had to guess, I know there's about 25,000 lines of shared libraries, which sounds like a lot, as it is. And a lot of shared plugins and stuff like that. I don't know the number of shared plugins or line numbers. Everything was deployed with Capistrano, pretty normal. Kind of a little interesting in their setup because they have 14 apps or 15 or whatever it is, so we had to be able to deploy all those apps at one time. And we kind of got around that. We had one of the system guys had a Perl script that would basically iterate all the apps and just deploy. So it's pretty flat. We use Memcache Client, which is just an improved version of Memcache library for Ruby. It's pure Ruby, much faster than the old implementation. And then to a very small degree, they use some fragment caching, page caching, and then we did some other like method caching for methods that would take a long period of time. We use Lucene for some searching. So they have an obituary database that's like 79 million records, something like that. And so initially they used Lucene for that. It's all in MySQL now for proper reasons. And then of course the database was MySQL, one box. So, any other questions about that?
Well, now that you mentioned the obituaries, like this isn't a technical question, but there was a lot of press that Eon's got about death alerts.
Yeah.
Like how did they handle that exactly?
So John would probably be a better guy to talk about that, but
well, so I think every day, so I worked partly on the OVIDS project for a while. I didn't deal a lot with the alerts, but in general, people could create saved searches, essentially, that would be performed on a scheduled basis, whether like once a day or once a week or something. And it would query against the Lucene index, and if there are any matching records, it would send out alerts about that. So somebody might look for people in their town, or their high school.
yeah, they used cron, I think, to send all this stuff. And ultimately, what they ended up deciding, they talked to some pretty high-powered Lucene, the guy who wrote the Lucene in Action book or whatever. He basically said, your usage of Lucene really isn't great. It's not a good usage for it. We had issues with data synchronization. So we had to wait like 24 hours for some data to show up. It was kind of an issue. And he kind of took that short look at it and was like, no, not a good choice. So they went another way, which so far has been pretty bad.
I was going to ask you about that. I'm sorry. I know I've heard the name Lucene. Is that a full text search?
Yeah, so it's a lot like Ferret.
Okay.
In fact,
Ferret is
is yeah. So Ferret is a rewrite of Lucene and Ruby, and then to see and who knows where to look. So, yeah, kind of stuff like that. And then the traffic. So I'll probably share a bunch of trade secrets, which people will get very upset about. At peak, they've done over 2.5 million dynamic page views in one day. In like a series of days, maybe 5 or 6 million or something like that. So, which is pretty decent stats.
Sorry, I'm curious. Were you guys monitoring the server performance when you hit that peak?
Yeah. So, yeah. Yes. Yeah. So fortunately and unfortunately, there were some minor issues. I wouldn't say that there wasn't at all. A lot of it was based around things like we kind of stuck with a specific version of Mongrel. Kind of at launch, we said, okay, we're going to stick with version X, which really wasn't a great choice. Not my choice, but a choice. And so ultimately what ended up happening was older versions of Mongrel had this kind of threading related issue, Mutex issue. They came out with this fast thread library to basically resolve it. And so we were using an old version that wasn't patched in such a way. And so ultimately, I think the term that they used was whack-a-mole, which is basically like, a process dies, and what would happen is it would continuously queue requests, but because it was thread locked, it would just be like, oh, okay, I'm going to take these requests, but I'm not really going to do anything with them. So, and then they do have like a couple 100,000 accounts, something like that. And I guess the only other interesting thing I can say about it, as far as the whack-a-mole part of it, is we did write a lot of custom code to kind of do logging and stuff like that. So we have some custom libraries that are kind of like Rails engines, but we're much more lightweight. It's like 7 lines of code or something like that, which basically pushes a bunch of methods into all the apps when they get started up, not through copying, but through changing the routing and saying, oh, okay, every app responds to these methods. One of the methods is a static method. One is a dynamic method that hits the database. And then our monitoring tools basically every 30 seconds just go, oh, okay, are you still up? Are you still up? Are you still up? And the pages serve a lot of requests, so not a real issue. I think they can do
So
about a couple hundred.
other than the mongrel bug that you tripped across,
Yeah.
you were able to.
It definitely
sustain-
wasn't a bug. So
Well, I mean, other than the
Yeah.
thread starvation with mongrel, you were able
Yeah.
to sustain 2.5 million
Oh,
hits
yeah,
on
yeah.
the
So-
8 machines.
yeah, so peak bandwidth was like 45 megabits or something like that.
Do you know how many mongrels you were running?
Yeah. So we have one of the setup kind of issues was every box ran every app, and every app ran 3 mongrels, excluding the login and user services app, which ran 5 mongrels. So if you do the math, 14, 3, 8, it's pretty insane.
It's like 200 something.
Yeah,
Right.
it's pretty high.
I remember you telling me that you brought that in and he told you that that was way too many.
Yeah, so that was the kind of the two things is it was easy to get us to upgrade to the new version of Mongrel. I just kind of like went to Zen and said, hey, like get these guys to upgrade, and it was kind of easy that way. And that was the other part is we tried to contract with them. I said, hey, can you like look at this stuff because this is something I can't change, but you obviously could. And he was like, whoa, okay, how many? You know, and he's like, yeah, that'd be like the first thing I would change if I got in. But he's been like super, super cool. They've made a lot of interesting requests of him. Like, oh, you know, can you completely rewrite the back end of Mongrel? Like people, you know how he has that on his website, you know, people joke about it. They like were really serious. They like tried to approach him and say, can you rewrite Mongrel completely because we think this way would be better. Not good. So, but ultimately, I mean, yeah. As far as you know, I'm very happy that they ended up going with Mongrel. They tried fast CGI, which I think is, if it's set up right, is good and probably faster than Mongrel. But in that situation, it was not going to work. So what ended up happening was they did some minor testing with fast CGI and it started dying like crazy. And it was like, okay, well, Mongrel's a lot easier to set up. You know, let's see where it goes. Kind of working set up.
Just in general terms, could you describe how you use multiple mongrels per app? And in a very naive view, I just have sort of this view of, you know, one app, one mongrel kind of thing.
So I would strongly suggest that you never do that.
Yeah.
Ever. So, which is because, so, how do I put this? So Rails is single-threaded, right? And Mongrel is not truly multi-threaded because Ruby doesn't truly have system-level threads. So what would end up happening if you had a single Mongrel is, let's say you made a service request to yourself. So hypothetically, let's say you had multiple apps or a single app and you said, oh, okay, I need this data. Or let's say that thread has a long-running process, like something that's going to take 60 seconds of search indexing. Your site is basically not accessible. So it's kind of first come, first serve.
And how do you set up the Rails app so that it...
So, and that's the other part of it. So we used Mongrel Cluster, which was written by a company called Rails Machine. Zach Dennis. No, that's not his name. I don't know his name. But yeah, it's written by a company called Rails Machine. It's completely free. It's
Wow.
basically super, super simple. It's a YAML config file. And,
So how does that work with Apache?
and then the other part, so if you use Apache 2.0, you would use like reverse, you'd use proxy pass reverse. And if you use Apache 2.2, then you use what's called mod proxy balancer, which is basically you create a balance set. So it's like, oh, okay, I have these mongrels running on this port. So it's literally like, you know, localhost 8000, localhost 8001, localhost 8002, and this is your balancer, your group. And then you would say, oh, okay, well this site actually balances through this container, and which is specified in a different section, or however you want to do it. And then as the apps hit, in Apache, as far as I know, and this is not definite, I believe that it's you know, like first hit goes to first one, second hit goes to the second one, third hit goes to the third one, back to the first.
I believe you can weigh that.
Yeah, and I don't know if in Apache you can. I know in
No, in the
like
mod
VPN
proxy
stuff.
balancer thing, I believe there's a statement there that you can give it higher priorities.
Okay, which is probably most likely, which we did not. So our setup was very, very, very standard.
I thought you could also give it affinity for incoming IP address.
Oh, what?
I thought you could also give it affinity for incoming IP addresses, so that you're supposed to help out with sessions.
Oh, okay. Well, so the other issue with that is that all of our session stuff was stored in Memcache because the load balancers have no understanding of state at all because they're software, and and save money and all these wonderful things. So yeah, so we ended up using Memcache, which worked out really well. Obviously, if you don't mind the caches going away.
Was it a bottleneck on Memcache at all?
Definitely not.
I'm very naive when it comes to having multiple applications in Rails, but it's probably a simple question. But how do you share your models across the different applications if they're?
So we did not, but it is very easy to. So, well, I shouldn't say that. So we shared one model across all the apps, which was this this model that we would have used to do the monitoring. That would make it hit out to the database. But it isn't very hard. With Subversion, you can set up these externals,
Okay.
and it's just a directory.
So you just map like a view into.
Well, yeah, and the thing with externals is you can't map a file. It must be a directory.
Okay.
So how do you get that with a specific model then?
And so the one that's injected, it's basically it's Rails version specific. So it's like, okay, if you have Rails version 1, this is how the routing works, and we have some code that rewrites the routing extension. It's like whatever it is, recognized route or something like that. And then in Rails 1.6, you do it another way, and then in Rails 1.2, you actually do it the right way, which is you say, oh, the controller path includes this directory, and then it automatically picks it up, and the model path includes this directory. So they created accessors for model path and controller path.
When you say sharing a model across different applications, do you mean like a model definition, like the model code file, or do you mean like the data contained in a database table?
Well, all of the above.
Oh, okay.
So I think the context he was talking about is sharing the physical model file.
Right,
Yeah.
but I'm assuming you use Memcache, right, to
Yeah.
save your model, and then that will be retrieved somewhere else.
You don't have to though. So in our setup, well, depending on how scalable you get, DB wasn't a real issue for us even at peak. It was, a reasonable percentage, but it wasn't bad, and there's still a lot of optimization that could have been done. But in MySQL, you can specify the full table name, which, so basically you can say, oh, okay, I want to join this from this database with this other database.
Okay.
And it's completely cool as long as they're on the same box. And that's where the scalability issue comes in, is, all right, what about when this is not on the same box? Then how do I access this stuff? And then you have to obviously refactor.
Would it have been reasonable to host that model as like a service, like over Active Resource, or like some REST-based service, where as long as it's like internal on your network, like there's no latency issues about getting the data from that model service?
I think totally, yeah. I think that there's a lot of places for exploration on that stuff. Definitely.
I can talk about that just briefly. We've deployed one Rails app to production currently that's doing just that. We've got we've used an active service, used the active service code to set up a series of services for accessing a product database that all of our applications can use, and it's really just web service calls at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So,
is that using some like standard, or like what was it, like a package, or did you write the service yourself?
we wrote the service, but using active service, it's trivial.
Okay, cool.
Did you use Active Resource at all for that, or for the client side?
I don't know, actually. I wasn't on the team that wrote it.
I don't think it works with Active Service. I think Active Resource is designed to work with the rest.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
We used Active Resource in one production application at work actually, and it was very fruitful. It was very easy to use, and the interface is extremely simple. You just call user like model.find in one application, and like it gets it in the other application as if it were a local model.
oh yeah, no, actually, we're not using. We are actually not using it that way because we're actually consuming SOAP services as well.
Okay.
I had a question too about database connections.
Yeah.
And how that's handled in a multiple Mongrels environment. So is every Mongrel making a connection to the database?
Yes.
Okay.
So,
And then the other question I had too, and this is something actually I ran into with my application, is that I was running some very long running processes, so I had to spin them off into a thread. And I don't know if you've had experience with this, but one of the things I noticed was odd is that I would have an object, it would spin it off, put it in the thread would run, the object would contain all its data, but none of the active record methods would work unless I reloaded the object from a find command, let's say.
okay.
And I was sort of wondering, and presumably it's that thread that's spun off will be using the same connection as that particular mongrel server, so that if the user continues to use the application, continues to hit the Mongo server, right, they would still.
So you're saying that
You
the
do
method
have
support
Rails.
fine?
Yeah.
Rails disables concurrency active record.
Oh,
Specifically
Can you enable that?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's
Okay.
class level instance variables and some of active record stuff,
Yeah, 'cause
which
it
is
doesn't-
basically they're
Right.
shared. So it's like if there were real threading, what would end up happening is you'd end up having these issues where you would see what he had basically from another request. So
Real threading, by the way, from what I've heard, is supposed to come in 1.9.
yeah, definitely.
Although it's going to be like Python, where there's one big block that kind of slows it down. It's still much better than what it
Yeah,
is.
the giant block system. Yeah.
Just
Better
very
than nothing for sure.
just very recently, in the last day or two, Ruby 1.8.6 came out, and they didn't redo threading in the same way that they're going to for 1.9, but they made a much faster C implementation of it. So if you're trying to use it, your performance would probably be improved if you updated.
Yeah, to that point, the fast thread library, which replaces the threading stuff in Mongo that it's ultimately updated to, was included in Rails, and that's actually what the library is. It's the same
okay.
thing. So,
Cool.
Which is awesome. Yeah, I think that's.
So another question that I had was, because I'm really interested about the scalability of that system.
Okay.
Did you have any problems with, you said there were 2 load balancers, Ryan?
So there were 2 load balancers, and they were tested pretty high to be able to do, I don't know, a couple hundred each or something.
Do you have any slow running, like I worked at City Search for a while, and we had a large network. We actually had to have a decent number of servers that were front-end proxy servers, just to serve up slow content, a lot of the larger static stuff.
Oh, okay.
Did you have any kind of problems with that sort of thing? It was mostly because of slow download speeds on the client side.
Right. So that's where you're locked with the client because he's downloading some huge.
There's a good blog about Ruby and Rails performance. It's Ruby Express. Is that it?
Rails Express.
Rails Express.
Oh yeah.
It's actually really good, and he has a whole thing about scalability. He talks about using proxies to serve static content or to cache content. and all that.
When you say proxy, you mean a reverse proxy in this case?
Using like Squid.
Right, but
Yeah.
that would be a reverse proxy as
Right.
opposed to like the standard, cache my web page when we
Right.
go out and browse it.
Yeah.
Cache static images.
Yeah. So to answer the question about large content and all that stuff, really we didn't have any, or we didn't have any really long running processes.
Did you have any kind of issues with scalability with the system?
So the other part I would say about that is we didn't have a lot of Ruby people, so which I think is a good indication of kind of it worked out well. We didn't have any serious scalability issues. I would say code quality, because almost every person was learning Ruby for the first time, was probably poor, which means that ultimately. I mean, it was a matter of us throwing more hardware at it and then cache to kind of, offset the stuff that wasn't going to be able to be shared across boxes. So, I guess the lesson is like, you can throw hardware at it in that situation. When you run long running processes, obviously, it's kind of a different situation. But yeah.
So if you could just blow everything up and restart,
Yeah.
what would you change versus what you just said?
So it's actually funny. I was thinking about that while here. So I think one of the biggest things is there's a company, Revolution Health. Anybody heard of it?
It's Steve Case.
Yeah. So it's cool because they made a blog recently and started kind of sharing their stuff, and I think it's awesome because the guys they're all very decent.
Revolution on Rails.
Yeah.
Is the blog.
And so Revolution on Rails, and basically one of their ideas, which I think that we didn't use, we had big issues with the subversion externals. And so what happens with subversion externals is you can't really, you basically get the latest of whatever you're pointed at. And in our case, all our externals pointed to the trunk. And so it's very hard to version control them, obviously, in that kind of a situation. And so that was one of the big things that I pushed for kind of near the end of my tenure there. Was kind of like, the guys at Revolution Health, they decided to go in the direction of creating gems for these things. and then basically be able to say, oh, okay, I want to use this version of this, and this version of this thing over here, and this version of this thing over here. Which to me, when I saw it, it was like, I wish I would have thought of that, too bad I didn't, you know, but obviously we got to switch because it's a big issue for them, you know, so we have like a service library, and we have a lot of libraries that we use that were either written in-house for sharing code or however doing services that we had those issues with, like, oh, okay, when we deploy this, let's look at the change logs of all these projects and see what is going to go out, you know. So it was a big issue that way.
There's also a new tool called Distant that we've been looking into.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's new though, but it's been around, yeah, I think it's been around for a while, but it is really good, and it locks, right? So you basically say, okay, Piston, there's a, I don't know what the name is, Piston, something that locks to a certain version or something. And so I suggested that, unfortunately, it didn't work.
So Piston is like a lay on top of VSV and externals?
So as far as I understand it, yeah, I think what it does is it, either one of two things, either it physically does like an export, or it sets a property in your SVN prop, which basically says, oh, okay, like stick at this version. I don't know.
I'm sorry, actually, you're right, it does both those things.
Yeah.
I was wrong. It doesn't actually
I don't know
use
if
externals, because that's a problem that we have, and it wouldn't have solved it, but it exports to a certain version and then sets its own custom subversion property, so it knows what version it's exporting at.
So I'll only go through a couple of other tiny things that I changed, because I could really go forever, and I would get to it. So the other thing is, open the site, this header thing, and the footer at the bottom are, they're also externals. So we have a bunch of views that are externals. Same issue, you know, same kind of thing, but it was actually interesting when I went to the MathWorks to kind of find out what they were up to, and had a couple of conversations with them. One of the issues that we had is some of our apps were web objects, Java, things like that, apps that couldn't consume Ruby views, or possibly could, but you know, not worth the effort kind of a thing. And so I think that should have been made a service. So it's like, oh, okay, you know, hey, I need to get the header for this, a long bound user, I need to get the header for that, or potentially do something like JavaScript or whatever. Some way of embedding your own content, whether it's like sending through a bunch of, oh, okay, this is the username and this is some other stuff. They're relatively static items that we kind of made much more complicated by going, oh, okay, this has to be externals, and these are going to be updated, and we're going to have all these other kind of issues.
Even if server side included, we do that.
Yeah, and I think that's totally right. Yeah, so I think that, I mean, a lot of those things, you know, I guess the ultimate downfall is a lot of the, you know, there wasn't a lot of, some of the architectural things that I think that kind of are longstanding, you know, that are going to last for a long time. You have to really think about those. And yeah, I mean, that's the ultimate thing. It's kind of like, there wasn't a lot of people came in, didn't do Ruby, like I said before, so looking at a lot of the code, it was really tough. From a maintenance standpoint, things like that, there's a lot of that. So it's a lot of, you know, going back, I would say I want to get more people who are interested in Ruby, who are, you know, strong in Ruby, kind of more do things, you know, more the Ruby way.
Well, you were the only Ruby developer that in Ruby or Rails before.
John was.
They started on.
So, yeah.
How did they decide to go with Ruby? You know, it's just instead of Java and
They went with all of them.
So they
Is that
didn't
the
actually
approach?
go with everything, but they kind of thought it would be interesting, and it's a new technology was kind of the thing. So.
So is it a technical person, a chief technology officer kind of person, or a venture capitalist? Or
Yeah, so they have a cool guy. Actually,
Yeah.
I shouldn't say that. So they have a really cool guy who's their CTO. His
Yeah.
name's Reed Sturman, which no one probably knows that name.
I do actually know.
Okay,
Yeah.
so you probably do.
Yeah.
But
And you're
Reed
right.
is kind of like a super genius. I don't know, he incubated a lot of cool stuff like Picasa and Compete, where we had a meeting a little while ago. Reed basically started all that, a lot of other stuff. So he's a super, super smart guy, for sure. So, super quiet, zen. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that's the most of it. The other thing is there's a lot of static content. We used movable type, which I thought really sucked personally. And I kind of said that before we launched, but it didn't work. Yeah, I mean, ultimately it didn't work. It was like, it would have been much better to probably do it in another system. We were using this Perl movable type, and we had all these Perl scripts written to, oh, okay, we need to export this, and now we need to get this to QA and dev. And there was a lot of work involved in, and all that stuff's not dynamic, so you were doing like regular expressions on all the content. Go, oh, okay, change all the links from dev to, QA, change all the links from QA to dev. It was kind of not a great system, and it doesn't really, Rails is real great at doing things like caching and things like that, where I think we didn't really have we couldn't do the best possible things because of kind of the situation we were in. So.
Where is the sort of the cutoff point, or is there a cutoff point at which you would, you might not build Amazon.com with Rails, or you might build certain applications with it. Have you got a sense of that? Because that seems to come up periodically.
Yeah, it's funny. People ask that stuff all the time, and I guess I hate being the person who talks about it, sort of. So everyone asks that all the time. Like, so when I went to events, so John, to be fair, wasn't there when I first started, sort of, I don't know. And so there was a lot of, every person that I met, it was kind of like, oh, well, can this thing scale? I had like designers sending me emails going, can this thing scale? And I'm like, I don't know how to respond to this, like, what do I say? So, and, it was like, yes, I think depending on these things, depending on hardware that we're going to get, yes, I think so. My background personally was that the sites that I had built were all small to medium-sized Rails sites. And so for me, it was kind of like, yeah, sure, definitely. I mean, we can get there, but I mean, there was no, I couldn't physically show some proof. But yeah, I mean, I think with Rails, it's more an issue of a couple things. It's certain sites are very cacheable. Caching is great. It's like the most wonderful thing in the world when it can be done, obviously without like killing yourself or rewriting the whole page of JavaScript to make it dynamic or something. But that's where you really win. Is like, oh, okay, this page can completely be cached. Now you're talking 4,000 requests, or something to that effect. I'm not trying to throw numbers. But yeah, so every site kind of has its limit. It's like, oh, okay, if it's super dynamic, maybe it's not as great of a, for a small company who's going to have like one server and potentially won't be very scalable. But I think the big thing is, with Memcache, the whole Ruby setup, the direction that Ruby's going with things like Yarn and native threads, it's great. So I think it can handle a lot of stuff. I think people don't give it the credit it deserves.
I was going to say that I actually feel the same way. I think, citysearch.com is run on Perl,
yeah.
Which essentially is going to have the same problems that Ruby does, mostly memory bound. 50 megs per process kind of stuff. So it means you just need large amounts of memory. But then I was talking to another company about 6 months ago, and they were doing a very large amount of back-end data importing. And they said that they were actually having what they thought were insurmountable problems with Ruby in latency issues and getting Ruby to react or to move fast enough. And I couldn't really get much better details on it.
So are they referring to like Ruby or Rails or Active Record?
Ruby, right? Ruby and Active Record.
Okay, so
but not actually Rails. It's not. It wasn't. I didn't think it was a web thing as much as they had to move such a large amount of data into their database in a single overnight span that it just wasn't able. Ruby couldn't keep up within the time that they needed to have.
Yeah. So I would suggest that they talk to this.
There's a really good post by DHH about scaling, being like, these are the same problems that have already been solved. It's not a Ruby issue. It's not a Rails
Right.
thing. And he actually iterates over it really well, I think.
Yeah, I think it's the post is something like scaling with Rails is easy or it's boring.
Yeah, it's boring.
Right.
Yeah.
So this guy hails from my city and state, which is great. And he basically was in the same issue, so he had like millions of rows that needed to be imported. And he wrote this thing, Active Record Extensions, which he just tried to get included into Rails. And it basically has a lot of like faster CSV and XML pulling in. And he does a lot of it. He has benchmarks. I don't know off the top of my head, but it's crazy stuff like, oh, this takes an hour if you use Active Record straight. If you use my extensions, it takes 20 seconds or something ridiculous. Those aren't real numbers, but it's something like that. I mean, it's it's like ungodly.
I should also say that I'm not sure how much I trust the work of these guys because their solution was to then rewrite part of the back end in Haskell, which is faster, but it's like that's not where we normally think we're going right away.
One of the issues with the experience with the Active Record is it doesn't use competitive statements. So
right,
I actually Sharky wrote just a a little class that basically takes an active record object, makes a prepared statement out of it, you can feed. And that's great if you just want to basically update a single object type, you can just keep feeding these updates into the prepared statements. I think for about 5-fold increase on that.
You don't have to parse and execute.
Have you done anything?
No,
with
basically
that?
I used, I wrote the class that uses Ruby DBI, and you feed it an active record, and it uses that as a template to set up the prepared statement, and then you feed it an array of active records, and it'll dump it into the database. And that solves the problem essentially. You're using prepared statements that
I mean, I was going to say,
derived from the active
if
record.
it didn't
and
use DBI, I know that in terms of active record and prepared statements, it's something that people are open to. It's not.
No, see, I mean, actually, I did realize that it doesn't make sense to have prepared statements in active records because active record is a single row. And what you're doing in prepared statements is you're repeating the same thing over again. So you're not at that granularity, you're kind of higher. You need some, what you really want is a prepared statement that acts on an array of active records. It makes sense to act on an array of active records or a bunch of active records. It doesn't make sense to have prepared statement in active record because it's one row,
Right.
essentially.
Right.
So that's why I wrote this thing that says you can either give it an array of active records, which it uses the first top one to kind of set up the prepared statements and just churns the rest of the thing into the database, or you give it one that sets up the statement, and then you keep adding it until you can call commit, and that's all.
That's
Yeah.
yeah,
Or
there's
rollback,
actually
you can call
a
rollback.
good series of posts on like the mailing list where basically they respond to the idea of prepared statements and say it doesn't.
Yeah, I
doesn't
did a
match.
lot. Yeah, exactly. I did search, and then finally I understood that they really don't talk about prepared statement because it doesn't make sense in active record at all.
Right. That being said, if someone were to implement the changes required to active record to actually have prepared statements are so intensive that that's one of the reasons why it's not done too.
Well,
because it needs to be done on a database specific.
yeah, I
thing.
mean, I do kind of look up a little bit of database specific code because the adapters kind of tell you
Right.
a little way.
Yeah, but prepared statements don't need to be, but in order to put them into active record, the way it's coded now,
Right,
you need to put
possibly.
it in every driver, and that's just, yeah, that's not good.
That's funny. Yeah, so I think that's ultimately it. We built a lot of code that I kind of open sourced. Yeah, I mean, to some degree, there's a lot of stuff that was opened from the EONS project that was like, oh, okay, we needed this, a bunch of stuff like that. I managed to write some cool stuff that people seem to like. So I showed Tom something and said, check this out. And he was like, you should totally submit that. And I did. Got accepted. Yay. So that was cool. Kind of rocket. So yeah, my site, I think everybody, you can probably find it off the thing, but there's a bunch of, it's like the ugliest site, but there's a bunch of stuff that was opened from that. So it's like the config application that we use to kind of generate the config files, some caching stuff. I have no idea what this is doing here. We needed, Rails doesn't support MySQL views because, or dumping structures because it's not, every database doesn't necessarily support it in the same format. So there was a thing for that kind of thing. It's a bunch of interesting stuff.
Some Rails API site.
None of that. That's enough for today. So, yeah, that's all.